man was he. He led the Soviet people on the road to victory. All through the revolution he fought at Lenin's side, and they made a combination till the day that Lenin died. He said, come on, you people, we must work with brain and hand. And then one day the Nazis came into the Soviet land. They plundered to the Volga, to Stalingrad. And then Joe Stalin said, come on, me boys, and kicked them out again. Oh, Stalin was a southerner, in Georgia he was born, where the oranges grow thick and fast and fields of waving corn. And Stalin is a farmer, his fingers they are green, and he has planted the biggest crop the world has ever seen. One day he looked upon the map and frowned and shook his head. There's too much brown and not enough green, these were the words he said. We'll have to change the weather, boys, he said, and then he smiled. So let's begin by planting trees along 3,000 miles. So Stalin rolled his sleeves up then and said it's time to start. The Volga River and the Don, they are too far apart. I think we'd better join them, so come and help me, pal, and we'll build a mighty waterway, the Volga-Don Canal. Then Stalin went into the north, and there saw rivers three, all emptying their waters into the polar sea. Now that's not right, Joe Stalin said, these rivers, they are ours. We'll turn them round and make them work and make electric power. There was a range of mountains that were standing in the way, so Stalin put his hand out and smoothed them all away. For Joe, he is determined to make the land all green, and that's the biggest project that the world has ever seen. Oh, Stalin is a mighty man, and he has a mighty plan. He's harnessed nature to the plow to work for the good of man. He's hammered out the future, the fortunate he has seen, and he's made the worker state the best the world has ever seen.
عاجبني ويجاهد عاش بكفاحه الخالد عاجبني ويجاهد عاش بكفاحه الخالد راجل واحد مبدأ واحد
عاش جيل ثورتنا
عاش الجندي يوم ما حطم شوكة الاستعمار كان عنوان النصر الثوري في كل بلد أحرار عاش الجندي يوم ما حطم شوكة الاستعمار كان عنوان النصر الثوري في كل بلد أحرار وسمعنا بيقولها قوية باسم مبادئ أبية
وسمعنا بيقولها قوية باسم مبادئ
خط هجوم ودفاع، أنا رمز سلام وصراع، أفدي بالروح وأعيش في النصر بطل وشجاع. أنا خط هجوم ودفاع، أنا رمز سلام وصراع، أفدي بالروح وأعيش في النصر بطل وشجاع. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش الجندي العربي عاش.
عاش الزرع يوم الشمس ما حست بيها عليه، فرشت نورها وكبر الزرع وهو مداري عليه. عاش الزرع يوم الشمس ما حست بيها عليه، فرشت نورها وكبر الزرع وهو مداري عليه. وسمعناه بيقولها قوية أرض ولادي ورجعت ليا.
وسمعنا بيقولها هوية أرض ولادي ورجعت ليا.
حرمونا سنين وسنين وافتكروا الناس نايمين، وطلعنا عليهم يوم خلصنا حقهم ملايين. حرمونا سنين وسنين وافتكروا الناس نايمين، وطلعنا عليهم يوم خلصنا حقهم ملايين. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش فلاح الثورة عاش.
عاش الفن حضارة الأمة يبنيها الفنان، يروى حياتها في غنوة في كلمة في صورة بروح وإيمان. عاش الفن حضارة الأمة يبنيها الفنان، يروى حياتها في غنوة في كلمة في صورة بروح وإيمان. واسمعنا بيقولها قوية مجد بلادي عهد عليا.
وسمعنا بيقولها هوية مجد بلادي عهد عليا.
قلبي وروحي ملك الفني والاتنين لبلادي هدية. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش الفن رسالة عاش.
عاش العامل يوم ما فكر يبني البلد ودار، فيها مداخل طالع منها لهب النور والنار. عاش العامل يوم ما فكر يبني البلد ودار، فيها مداخل طالع منها لهب النور والنار. واسمعنا بيقولها قوية ده إنتاجي وصنع ايديا.
وسمعنا بيقولها هوية ده إنتاجي وصنع يديا.
حققنا بعون الله للشعب.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome along. It is the evening of the 24th of January 2024, and it is 22:37 British time, which, as you all know, thanks to the dominance of British imperialism, is the time standard set for the world. So, we come to you this evening to examine a number of issues, including, of course, the toings and froings of a potential power struggle in Kiev, the rats fighting in a sack, it would seem. And you have also the remarkable story of the Russian victory that involved many of their men crawling for at least a kilometre through a semi-flooded piping system. Very interesting points there coming from the battles around Avdiivka. And we have Tobias Ellwood and various other British generals declaring that it's time to bring back national service, stand by for the foundations of a new Dad's army, of which more later, etc., etc. The British ruling class and their various acolytes seemingly are losing their minds and their always fragile grip on reality, bit by bit, as the reality of the situation in Ukraine becomes ever clearer. We also have, of course, the Israelis committing various crimes in Gaza, including blowing some guy away just after he'd finished doing an interview with a British news network, which a crime that was so brazen in its execution, quite literal execution, that the said news network, ITN, which is normally about as reactionary as it's possible to get, along with all the other news networks in Britain, was obliged to run it as a lead story tonight. So that's an interesting development there. So we will get to all of these things in due time. But first of all, let us greet those who are in the chat this evening. So we have C. Bolt, who says that I'm in nice and early once again. Bid you a good evening, comrades, and a good evening to you as well. Red Star Betty says, good evening, comrades from County Durham, where my bike passed the MOT today. You take your bike for an MOT? I usually just use them until they get stolen, which is about 6 months in Manchester. Hello to James Graham. Movie Maker Joe says, the music is always uplifting. Thanks, Alexander. It's great to be able to catch a live. Yes, well, good to have you with us. And if you're interested in getting a hold of the CD, which contains many of those songs in the introduction, then email me at the usual address. So, Rianne, good evening to you. Have you become an anarchist? Is that why you're waving the black flag? Oh, right, you meant it to be a Welsh flag. Okay. Just as long as it's not a yellow and black flag. We don't want any Javier Milei fans in here. Or perhaps we do. If you're a Javier Milei fan and want to debate anarcho-capitalism and communism, be sure to email me at the regular address. Good evening to Lucas, who's pausing a reading of the German ideology to catch this live stream. Well, appreciate you pausing your reading of one of the foundational texts of Marxism. I haven't read that for a long time, actually. It may well be worth going back to it. I think the version I read must have been a heavily cut down version, because I found another version published under the old Soviet publishing house, by the old Soviet publishing house. It was much longer. So, which version are you reading? Do let me know. Frank, who says, Farhad, say hello and thanks from California. Well, good afternoon, I think it must be to you out there on the west coast of the United States under the tyranny of American Psycho Newsom. Good evening to Terry, my comrade from the Class Consciousness Project, and good evening to Gerumpkin, who is over there in Dublin, just the other side of the Irish Sea, not too far away from where I am. And good evening to Beju, down there in Barnet, I believe, and Morgan, who says good evening from the 32-county island. Well, it will be 32 counties before too long, of that I am convinced. And then the question will be, what type of republic shall it be? Roddy, good evening to you. And AJ Williamson says, I hope this is intellectually stimulating. Well, we aim to please, but, don't put too much pressure on at the beginning. Bedstar Betty says, my last bike was stolen in November the 23, so November last year. Well, yeah, I've had, how many was it? I had 3 stolen in less than 2 years. The only one I didn't have stolen was one that was like utter crap. Like I got it from the chain store Halfords as part of a cycle to work scheme a few years ago, and it like had no suspension. It was a complete bone shaker, but that was the one that lasted me the longest because it was so crap and so cheap. Nobody wanted to steal it, which I guess is the ultimate security device. Rianne says, I'm not brain dead enough to be an anarchist. Fine words indeed. To be an anarchist, you have to be a teenager. I think that you have to be a teenager, you have to be obsessed with the idea that wearing black makes you edgy, and that, listening to like barely listenable, barely coherent music makes you interesting as well. It doesn't. Neither of those things do. Or that, a knowledge of whatever like bizarre ravings Mikhail Bakunin came out with, including his enthusiastic endorsement for the Confederacy, is somehow a way forward for the working class. It really isn't, though. Luca says, Prometheus books from Waterstones, so likely a cut-down version. Possibly. I need to get hold of the longer version. I know where I can get it from, but I haven't managed to attain it yet. I have a reading list longer than my arms at the moment. So let's get underway. So where we are at the moment is that going to be starting with the Ukraine situation, then moving on and tackling a question that came in on Telegram as well. So the big news coming out of the conflict zones, well, there's several, should we say. There's the toings and froings in Kiev, which I'll get to in just a moment. There is the Yemeni claim that they, and I see no reason for them to lie about this, that they've fired upon several US warships and forced US cargo ships to turn around. More on that when we get it, shall we say. And of course, there's the ongoing battles in Israel, of which there's a couple of things to mention. But let's do the Ukraine situation first. You will probably be aware at this stage that I mentioned it a few days ago, there's a lot of talk coming out of the usual channels on Telegram, the Russian channels, and the dissident Ukrainian ones about the fate of the everybody's favorite Banderist general, I jest, of course, which is, of course, Zaluzny, the man who I think was the target of a personal appeal on the eve of the special military operation by Putin and others in the Kremlin hierarchy. I think that they had an inkling that he might be inclined to go over to their team and be their guy who was going to run a replacement Kiev regime in the event that they managed to force the collapse of the Zelensky group and the broader group that makes up the sort of post-Maidan, post-2014 regime. There's an investigation into Zaluzny, or at least there was talk of one, by the Kiev regime, based on the idea that he didn't provide a sufficient defense in the first days of the Russian special military operation, when the Russian forces charged into a big area that they still largely hold in Zaporozhye and Kherson region, and that Zaluzny was supposed to organize the defense there, and that he didn't do so properly. That's what his enemies are claiming. Now, of course, this could be bullshit. It could be that he was unaware of the Russian intentions there. But I think that I want to take you back to Putin's speech on the eve of the special military operation. It's a speech I've watched a number of times. And if you recall that in that speech, Putin said, speaking directly to the Ukrainian military commanders, he urged them essentially to carry out a coup, dispose of Zelensky, and then they would be able to negotiate a deal between the new rulers of Ukraine, which presumably would be headed by Zaluzny, and the Kremlin. Go back and check the speech he gave on the occasion of the launch of the SMO. I believe it's that one, because he gave two speeches very quickly, one after the other. One recognizing the independence of Donetsk and Lugansk, and then another one announcing the beginning of the SMO. I think that what he clearly had intelligence on, that Russian intelligence services had clearly briefed the Kremlin leadership and said, we think that Zaluzny and possibly some others in the Ukrainian military hierarchy would be willing to flip to our team, take over the running of the state, and then we could do a deal with them. I think that that's probably what was meant to happen. Of course, as a plan in any kind of war situation, it would seem, only survives as long as it doesn't meet contact with the enemy. For whatever reason, that didn't happen, but I think that might have been behind some of what the Zelensky group is accusing Zaluzny of, or has been accusing Zaluzny of. That I think there has been suspicions in certain circles in Kiev that he's been playing both sides, or many different sides, for a while now. And certainly it would make a deal of sense that if the idea was that the Russian forces would storm in, and then the Ukrainian regime would implode, and then they would cut a deal with the successor. I think it makes much more sense that they would seek to cut a deal with the successor, given that this is specifically what Putin said on the eve of the SMO, that he would look to cut a deal with whoever followed Zelensky, given that, and again, I'm using his words here as my guidance on this, given that he said openly that they found it impossible to bargain and negotiate with the Maidan regime, and that he appealed to the military professionals of Ukraine to take action to remove the Zelensky group, and then he'd be able to negotiate with them. This proved ultimately to be an erroneous assumption. And I think the reason why it proved to be an erroneous assumption was twofold. There is every possibility that Zaluzny was having some sort of back channel talks, dropping hints to the Russians that, oh, well, maybe I could take over. But there's also the factor, and I think and Putin has admitted to this, that they underestimated how far the US imperialists were willing to go in their defense of their project in Ukraine. You see, when it came to the Georgia operation in 2008, if you recall, the American imperialists, of course, would have preferred it had the Georgians prevailed, but they couldn't really do much. They transported a group of Georgian soldiers back from Iraq to Georgia, but that was about it. And they didn't really do much, and the Europeans intervened quickly to secure a ceasefire, and ultimately Saakashvili, the unstable, tie-chomping maniac who was president of Georgia at the time, a long-term CIA investment in his career that was made there. Ultimately, he was disposed of. He popped up in Ukraine, where he tried to lead a new Maidan against Poroshenko and seize the country for himself, and now he's back in prison in various forms of mental, shall we say, meltdown in Georgia. But the Russians disposed of him fairly easily. His rule rapidly collapsed afterwards, and they found themselves, if not with the friendly government, then at least one that wasn't so rabid and determined to start a war over South Ossetia or Abkhazia or both. So again, I think that there was something similar in the pipeline here. I don't think that they wanted to end up negotiating with Zelensky. I think they wanted to end up negotiating with Zaluzny and whatever pseudo-military regime he put in place. But I think the influence of the US and the British in particular was too strong within the military hierarchy. And I think basically Zaluzny, to use a very popular Northwest English expression, his arse went. I think that when faced with this, he hesitated, and basically things unraveled in a different way. But I think the intent was clearly there, and I think the Russians clearly had a solid idea that Zelensky could be disposed of. Then they would do a deal with Zaluzny. But I think the influence of the Banderists inside the military and ultimately the influence of the US and the British imperialists was too great. And they very rapidly moved to prop up Zelensky and to throw their entire weight behind him. And there was a brief period of hesitation on behalf of the imperialists when the SMO began. If you recall General Milley going to Congress and saying, well, I think it's going to be over in 3 days, which it could have been had the Russians been bringing more weight to bear and been prepared to endure far more casualties than they were. But clearly their force they designed for this was meant purely for shock value, and they hoped that Zelensky and his clique would either panic and run away, or that Zaluzny would act and dispose of them. So here we are, and Zaluzny is now apparently on his way out, though this hasn't been confirmed yet. Clearly the Zelensky clique has a good deal of dirt on him, but he's probably been careful enough to gather a good deal of dirt on them, and I think there's probably plenty to gather on both sides. So the talk is that they want to replace him with this chinless maniac by the name of Kirill Budanov, who's the head of military intelligence, I believe. And Budanov is obviously a creature and a puppet of certainly MI6, maybe even more so MI6 than the CIA. I'm going back to the interviews I did with Kit Clarenberg about this, who incidentally will be returning to the show at some point in the near future, just trying to sort out a date for that. But what his reporting showed was that the British were the ones running a lot of the intelligence operations. It's now fairly well established that the British intelligence apparatus, they were the ones behind the what is best known as best called a psyop around the Bucha massacre, which was a massacre carried out by Ukrainian fascists and then converted into a massacre that was said to have been carried out by the Russians. It was obviously untrue from the very start. There's nowhere that the Russians have gone inside these, inside the east or the southeast of Ukraine, or indeed any other place that they've reported to have been, where a massacre has been reported, where they've gone in and massacred civilians. So far, that has not been the case, given that the way that this was sold is that this was a liberation operation. And also, the character of the Russian army doesn't run that way, given that all of the messaging coming from Putin all the way down through the ranks of the military was that Ukrainians are a brotherly people and we will treat them as such. Now, of course, that doesn't preclude some individual soldier or officer deciding to do something heinous. Armies are, particularly armies of a capitalist nation, are of course reflective of all the abominations you find in capitalist society. There will be all kinds in the Russian army, but there's been no report at any point in the last 2 years almost now that matches what was said to have happened, the story that the British came up with and tried to sell to the world of the Bucha massacre. It was a political operation, a psychological manipulation operation, designed to make sure that Zelensky or anybody else couldn't go near any possible agreement with the Russians, and to sell the idea that Putin is this sort of rampaging madman, the return of Genghis Khan or something like that, combined with Stalin, combined with, Ivan the Terrible, and anything else you want to throw into the mix as well. And that this was all one big horror that would be inflicted across the West unless Ukraine stood strong, all the usual bullshit. So, British are the ones, I think, anyway, that are basically running the intelligence side of this war. If you read the British defence and foreign policy reviews that were carried out under the Johnson administration, what it focused on was not quantity of armed forces overseas. It was what they would deem quality of armed forces overseas. Now, you can get into a debate about what the exact quality of the British armed forces are. I'm sure we could be here for quite a long time discussing that. But this is the plan they have. Not a giant presence overseas, but enough to ensure that their interests, i.e. the interests of the British ruling class, are secured. So that means a lot of intelligence operations, a lot of psychological operations, psychological warfare, the recruiting of local agents to represent British interests, all the usual thing. Bringing people over to Britain to train them in the ways of standing up for freedom in the British style. The usual thing. So it completely suits the way that the British have chosen to not just conduct themselves in terms of this Ukraine war, but the way in which they see their presence and the securing of their interests being carried out in overseas territories. And so that Budanov would be their creature is no surprise. Now, I think that also Zelensky is a co-creation of the British and the Americans, but I think Budanov is certainly run very heavily by MI6, and it would fit with the most aggressive elements inside the Washington, what you would call imperial bureaucracy, and in Britain, to have Budanov take over the running of the war. Now, why is that? And that is, it also points toward why there was this shoot down of this POW transport plane, Russian plane, earlier today. And that is that it's been clear for a while now. It was clear very early on, again, to go back to the early days, almost 2 years ago now, when the US government thought that the Ukrainians would collapse. They had a plan to reconstitute the war as essentially a guerrilla operation. This was what Hillary Clinton was gleeful about when she was interviewed very early on, that they were going to turn Ukraine into another Afghanistan for Russia. First of all, that's a fundamental misunderstanding of the Soviet war in Afghanistan. And second of all, you're not going to get that in Ukraine, which is, of course, a country which is much closer to Russia in every single sense, geographically, culturally, linguistically. So it's always been a bit of a fool's errand. But this is what they really want to do in terms of their plan now. They know, the more sensible of them, the ones who have still got at least a foot in reality in London and Washington, D.C., they understand that the conventional side of this is coming to an end, that the Ukrainian defenses are struggling every single day to hold the Russian lines, to hold the Russians back, and that eventually, again, sooner rather than later, this is going to go bad. And so they need another plan. There's been a lot of talk about, over the last few days, on various Russian Telegram channels, and the usual commentators, such as the Military Summary Channel, have made this point, that there is seemingly a plan in place to withdraw some kind of government to Western Ukraine, to Lvov, and essentially then turn old Galicia, the formerly Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth-occupied area, formerly Austro-Hungarian occupied areas, into what they would call the real Ukraine, and to essentially, if not abandon, then give up on wasting too many resources in holding everything, including everything beyond basically the 1914 border area, I would guess. And they think, that what they will do is that they will have the Russians take over the running of all of this area, and that they will make it as indigestible for Moscow as possible. And the way that they will do this is that they finally get the chance to enact their cheaper strategy in some respects, because funding a gigantic 1,000-kilometer long frontline war, a full blooded war, the kind of which hasn't really been seen on this scale in Europe since 1945, that's very expensive. Funding a microstate on the edge of Eastern Europe, which has a much smaller population and which will require many fewer resources, given that you will essentially withdraw to there. I think that my guess is that there is a plan to essentially declare that some sort of NATO protectorate, so that you can say that Ukraine has joined NATO and that we've won. And then what you do is then you use Budanov's network of saboteurs, spies, and scumbags to essentially carry out a long-running terror campaign, both inside Russia itself, but especially inside what will become the Russian territory of old Ukraine. And this will be their plan. It will be a little bit cheaper than what they're having to do at the moment. They can probably run it using the confiscated Russian assets plus donations, quote unquote, from EU countries. And also, it'll have the advantage that if things get a bit too awkward for them with regard to the number of refugees there, they can chuck the Ukrainian refugees out of Poland and back into the new Ukraine, or even chuck them back and force them into Russia, and hope that they become a discontented section of the population there, and maybe an asset for the future. All in all, I think that this is the way it's going to go. Zaluzny is still in post at the moment, it would seem, unless it was an AI rendering of him at this photo coming out of the meeting at, I believe, the Ramstein Air Force Base in Germany, where Lloyd Austin, or again, an AI rendering or an actor playing him, appeared and he said the usual, pablum about staying the course. But I mean, everybody with half a brain left in their heads inside London and Washington knows very well that if they try and carry on holding this gigantic front line, it's just going to disintegrate more and more and more. If they basically sacrifice all of the men that are there now, withdraw the Ukrainian administration to Lvov, declare that essentially a protectorate, and just then try and run the whole war as a terrorist operation inside what will then be Russian-controlled former Ukraine. That's a lot cheaper, and also you can then relegate it to much lower down the media running order. It has been already, and you can declare a result because you can put as a headline in all the papers and in all the news broadcasts. You can have Zelensky sitting in Lvov signing NATO membership documents for the postage stamp-like statelet that he's allowed to run now. So all in all, I think that is the way that it is going. Clearly, they can't hold on for that much longer on the front lines. The Russians are slowly strangling the Ukrainian forces everywhere you look. And again, the expense factor does come in when you see that the gigantic amount of money that Biden, or whoever the hell is running the administration in Washington, wanted for Ukraine is going to be probably less, unless, of course, Biden agrees to Republican demands on the wall, which it's up in the air whether they'll even reach an agreement on that as yet. So this is the way I think it's going. Zelensky out, probably into exile somewhere, or possibly disposed of if he tries to make an issue out of it. But Zelensky is not a man of particularly great courage, it would seem. He's gone along with every single harebrained scheme of Zelensky's for the last 2 years and beyond that. So he'll probably suck it up and go into exile with a briefcase full of dollars. Budanov is a psychopath backed up by the worst elements of the Banderites and fascists, plus MI6 and the CIA. So he's the ideal man to run the new version of the armed forces of Ukraine, which will be focused upon sabotage, assassinations, terror campaigns, rather than full spectrum like industrial warfare operations. So this is the end of one phase coming soon, I would say, and we will see what the immediate future holds. And if this prediction of mine proves to be wrong, well, I'll come back here and address it. So, moving then to other related issues, shall we say, you might have seen the rather spectacular Russian military operation that was taking place, or reportedly took place on the 19th of this month, which involved Russian special forces going through a kilometer-long underground pipeline that was seemingly dates back to back to the 60s or the 70s in the Soviet period, that's been flooded for years. And they found this about a year ago. They spent the last year essentially draining this to the point where it was passable by men going through, because this in this pipeline, which is in the area of the Avdiivka battles, passes straight under the Ukrainian front lines and comes out right in a convenient spot behind, or immediately behind, a Ukrainian base of operations. So they spent a year clearing this thing out, having to dive down into it to try and find where it went, covering up the digging through it that they were doing by constantly shelling the Ukrainian positions. So they dug this out by hand, stretched it, dug out all of the tunnel length, cleared it so that their forces could go through. Then they sent their forces through there on the 19th, popped up the other side of the front line, and took a garrison by surprise, killed a load of them, a load more surrendered, and it enabled the Russians to close in further around Avdiivka. It's certainly a spectacular operation, it would seem, and one that if this was an American one, the Hollywood movie would already be in the works. But they'd end up casting The Rock in it, and it'd probably flop. So just an indication of the kind of things that the Russians are doing to obtain, of course, the aspect of surprise. Given that the Ukrainians are not only flooding the skies with drones, but also that they have the full weight of the American and British and French spy networks, or electronic spy networks, the satellite networks of the United States available to them, and that this, of course, makes the aspects of surprise rather difficult to attain. So it's a fascinating story, and I'll come back to it in the future if there's any more that's said about it. Certainly, its spectacular operation. So, other things to mention here. We are seeing the operation commencing in Yemen, which I'm going to codename Flailing Impotence, which is all the US and the British imperialists are managing to do with their targeting of the Yemeni government. And Ansar Allah are the Yemeni government. There's no arguments about that. They are a organization or a coalition, really, that is more than a movement now. It represents a coherent government of Yemen that is connected to the Yemeni masses via these local council type organizations. So this is something which is sort of a combination of a Shia Islam informed version of Yemeni nationalism. There's elements in there that support this movement, which is this national movement, which come from the Yemeni socialist and communist forces. There's various other sort of Islamic and nationalist type forces, but this is a national liberation army that has fought a very successful war against the US imperialist-led attempt to destroy them since 2014. And so when, as their spokesmen have said over and over again, we knew, going all the way back to 2014, that it was the US imperialists bombing us since then, that the Saudis were acting as their agents. It was US bombs that were being dropped on Yemen since 2014. So this doesn't essentially change all that much. We're glad that they're saying they're glad that the Americans have come out into the open and are doing it themselves. And they are understandably not intimidated by anything the US and the British are throwing at them, because they've thrown it all at them before. The US and the British aren't doing anything that they didn't have the Saudi Air Force do. Remember, even the Guardian newspaper in Britain reported several years ago that the entire war on Yemen, waged ultimately by the Saudis as a proxy for US and British imperialism. This was run by US and British Air Force officers out of a command center inside Saudi Arabia. So without those officers running the war, without the constant supplies of aircraft and weaponry to be fired from those aircraft, the Saudis would not have been waging that war. And the Saudis ultimately soured on it in the end, given that they couldn't win it. It was costing them an awful lot of money. And that the Yemenis kept hitting their oil refineries in defiance of the vaunted Patriot missile system, the Patriot air defense system. Then it became a matter of sort of running sore and a humiliation for them. So I think that their inability to win that war motivated them to ultimately cut a deal with the Iranians in the hope of defusing the situation. So the US and the British have now been obliged to come out into the open and do it themselves. But again, they're not doing anything that they haven't done before. So that the Yemenis will, if not easily withstand it, they will be able to withstand it. They are as strong as they are because, and this comes back to the organizational question, it is clear if you observe how strong the Yemeni national movement is in terms of its ability to mobilize the masses, its ability to withstand the stranglehold or the attempted strangulation that the US carried out on Yemen between 2014 and really right the way up to today. They've already withstood sanctions. They've already withstood a naval blockade run by the Saudis. They've already withstood intensive US bombardment that goes back even before 2014, when Obama was using drones to bomb Yemen under the excuse that he was targeting Al-Qaeda or ISIS. Now, one thing I wanted to mention in passing was the fact that even the BBC now have been obliged to produce a documentary on this, admitting that the attacks that were attributed to ISIS in Yemen were actually carried out by US private military contractors, US mercenaries. Now, I haven't watched all of this yet. I will be watching it hopefully tomorrow or at least the day after in order to see what they're prepared to admit to in this thing. But as always, when the bourgeois press admits to a scandal, you can bet that it's only the tip of the iceberg. So if the US has been using the activities of mercenaries probably indirectly employed by the CIA, given the enormous number of so-called private contractors that the CIA has at its disposal. If the BBC, the lead imperialists network in the world, shall we say, certainly the oldest, is prepared to come out and say that attacks attributed to ISIS are being carried out actually by the forces of US imperialism, even though the BBC is not going to put it that way, that's a huge admission, because that confirms a lot of the information that Max Blumenthal brought to our attention in his book, The Management of Savagery, and a long time suspicion that I know a lot of Arab communists and nationalists and other anti-imperialists have had about ISIS itself, about Al-Qaeda, about all the other radical groups, shall we say, that the US uses to justify its presence in the region, that if these weren't being directly carried out by the US itself, then they were being done by people employed by the US. And if this is the case now, and the BBC is prepared to admit to it, well, we could be looking at a sort of slow opening of the floodgates on this. How bad is it? How bad is the coming scandal if the BBC's been obliged to do what, in American terms, I believe is referred to as a limited hangout operation, where you tell a partial version of the truth in the hope of getting out ahead of a much bigger and much more damaging story? So here we have a real confirmation, a real proof of those of us who were labelled as tankies, some of us wear the label quite proudly these days, for refusing to back the regime change operation and the bombing campaigns against Assad in Syria. Well, the worst suspicions that we had, the whole ISIS operation and Al-Qaeda operation was in fact masterminded out of Washington, D.C., or at least out of Langley. Well, this is looking to have been, now it's being slowly confirmed. So I will watch this documentary. I'll post it on the Telegram group. So be sure to take a look at it, because it's interesting that this ever got on the air. Whether it stays on the air is another question. So I'm going to try and find some way of downloading it and sticking it on YouTube. So interesting developments in Yemen. Apparently also today, the Yemenis have said, as I mentioned earlier, that they had a 2-hour exchange of fire with the US Navy, and that they forced US supply ships to turn around, because one of the things that they did the other day, the Yemenis, was that they fired upon a US military supply ship, and this was recorded apparently, and they're claiming now that 2 of these US supply ships were obliged to turn around. So this is, of course, a big problem now for the US imperialists. They've got a problem up in Syria, which is that due to the attacks carried out on their bases in northern Syria, they are apparently considering a withdrawal from the area, abandoning the area, and are trying now, you can believe the cheek of this one, to cut some sort of deal with the Syrian government, whereby the Kurdish forces, which have turned themselves, or their leaders have turned them, into essentially a mercenary army for the US, that they are trying to guarantee, I think, the so-called safety of the Kurdish forces, i.e. that they be allowed to be left in place. And they're trying to cut that deal with the government headed by President Assad. So I wouldn't be surprised if what happened was Assad said, oh yeah, sure, I agree to that. And then essentially slowly just took the area back over anyway. And the US imperialists will, of course, once they've abandoned the area, won't really care that much about what happens to the Kurdish forces, because as long as it doesn't make the front pages in the United States, and as long as nobody makes an issue out of it, politically speaking, and I think that neither, certainly the Democrats won't want to make an issue out of it. Trump may, but also bear in mind he wanted to get out of Syria and was thwarted, and part of the reasoning that was used by his opponents was, oh my God, you can't possibly abandon Kurds, as if the politicians that make up the viper's nest that is the US Congress care one whit what happens to the Kurdish population. The British imperialists didn't care what happened to them. The American imperialists don't either. But they're prepared to use this sort of moral blackmail and manipulation to make everybody feel as if the US has to stay there to protect the population who they put at risk in the first place by turning them into a proxy force. So the US is in a difficult situation in Syria. They are apparently looking to downscale their presence there or get out entirely. The Iraqi government, very weak comprador regime, but under extreme pressure from the popular mobilization units, has requested that the US leaves Iraq. The US will probably try and refuse, but they're currently, of course, bombing popular mobilization unit areas, or that's what they say they're doing in Iraq. Whether they can continue to decline this request is another matter entirely, or whether the Iraqi government is prepared to press this request, or whether it even can. But certainly the popular mobilization units can. And so Biden is left in an incredibly sticky situation where he is trying, or whoever's running the administration is trying, it would seem, to withdraw from Syria, but not have anybody notice. They are trying to stay put in Iraq, but ultimately may be forced to move out of there as well. So this is why I come to the conclusion that even though some of the stone-chewing psychopaths in the darker areas of Washington, D.C. and London have decided that now is the time to launch the war with Iran, I don't think they're going to be able to. Because if you think about this, as we've discussed before, the notion that the US and the British can invade Iran is completely fanciful. It's ludicrous. First of all, look at the size of the place. Again, we've covered the geography element before. We've covered the fact that the US and the British don't have the supply chain in place to be able to carry out the kind of operation themselves. Now, it may be the case that what the more maniacal elements in Washington and London want to do is to unleash all the terrorist forces that they've got trained. So that's the Mujahideen al-Kaq, the MEK, the former sort of bizarre pseudo-Marxist, pseudo-Khomeinist organization that existed in Iran in the late 70s as an opponent of the Shah, then defected and became a auxiliary force for Saddam Hussein, then became essentially a cat's paw of US imperialism. So there's them, there's the Balochistan separatist organization that the Iranians bombed in Pakistan, and the Pakistanis bombed in Iran, a sort of swap deal that was going on there. And then you've got the Kurdish forces in northwest Iran, which have been rattling around there and have been making trouble for the Tehran government for quite a long time, periodically. They're also potentially available for the usage of the US imperialists. But I would say that even if they manage to get this together, the MEK's capabilities seem to be mainly focused on carrying out bombings and assassinations. In terms of what they would try and do with these various terrorist organizations inside Iran, it would seem that mostly what they can try and do is that if their plan seems to be, as far as I can tell, judging from like the utterances of people like John Bolton, is that the US and the British will bomb Iran, and that these terrorist organizations, these insurgent groups, will start some sort of military operation on the ground, with the idea being that if the US and the British are carrying out bombing campaigns and that there's now a sort of spate of terrorist attacks or military assaults inside Iran itself, that this will destabilize the government and it will fall apart. Notice how it's always the same idea. Essentially the same idea that they had with Ukraine, just adopted for Iran, which was that we will use Banderist-led Ukraine to create a situation for Moscow inside the Donbass, and ultimately will manipulate this situation to the point where it weakens Tsar Vladimir I, and it will then lead to his destabilization under the combined impact of a war he can't win and a sanctions regime which has destroyed the Russian economy, and that this combined effect will lead to a revolt somehow, either a palace coup or some sort of situation will emerge that will enable the US and British color revolution assets in Moscow and St. Petersburg especially to come out into the open and be able to carry out the kind of regime change operation which these sort of color revolution operations have specialized in. I did a whole program on this on the audio version of the show a while back, but to summarize what my own analysis of color revolutions is, the US and the British spend a lot of money and have spent a lot of time developing what they would call civil society networks inside these countries. You saw this in Kiev in the Maidan itself, the Maidan coup 10 years ago. Essentially what these are is it's a combination. You get the people that you're prepared to put on camera, which are the students and the people waving the EU flags a lot of the time, especially in places like Georgia and Ukraine. The more telegenic end of the movement. So you put a lot of resources through NGOs into training them, and you get them ready to be mobilized and to go out into the streets with a lot of English language placards saying, down with the tyrant, we want freedom, we want to be in Europe, usual kind of thing. Kind of thing that Vladimir Zhirinovsky himself used to say back in 1991. Yeah, nobody likes to quote that anymore. But the point is that that will be that one end of a color revolution. Telegenic students who have mastered English, who speak English very well, who will go out and be interviewed by CNN or ABC or Sky News or ITN saying, all we want is to go out and watch Hollywood movie, and Mr. Putin, he won't let us. It is terrible. You must let us come to England and study Masters of Business Administration at Glorious University of Loughborough, or something like that. And this will be played round the clock to tug at the heartstrings, the various different Trotskyite organizations who still have some kind of wretched influence in Britain and the USA will declare immediately that this is a workers' uprising and needs to be supported. And at the same time, of course, you have the other end of a colour revolution, which is, aside from the telegenic students, you also then have the muscle of a colour revolution, which in Ukraine is of course typified by the Banderists and the various fascist organizations, which of course the CIA and MI6 have a history with, going all the way back, probably in MI6's case, to the 1920s and 1930s. And you then combine these together. You put the students on the street, and then you use the fascist types to go and cause a ruck, fight the police, cause a lot of violent scenes, cause the authorities to have to react. It's the playbook that that Ivan Kachanovsky has exposed with regard to Ukraine. Carry out false flag shootings, as was done in Romania, as was done in Romania in '89 to get rid of Ceausescu, as was done in Kiev in 2014 to spice things up further. So this is the plan. You have the PR wing of a color revolution, you have the muscle, and then you also have the people on the inside. You have the people in the ruling class itself of a particular country who and people who are already in the state machine who are already, if not openly, then secretly on side for this. And these consist of various characters like in the Ukrainian case, it was people who were surrounding the former disgusting bastard who was the president, Leonid Kushma, who of course kept an influential position in Ukraine after 2014. In the case of Russia, it was networks around the imprisoned and then exiled oligarch Khodorkovsky. He was the big hope for disposing of Putin back in 2004, if you recall. And that was the idea that Khodorkovsky would be the one who would be able to block the imposition of state monopolies in the oil and gas sector, and that he would then come in and take over from the ghastly Putin, and he would be the one who would be the sober Yeltsin for them. So, to reiterate, what a color revolution takes is, first of all, an unstable, largely a very corrupt and oligarchic regime which has very, very weak or non-existent links to the masses and is and that no one is really prepared to fight and die for it. Secondly, you need a solid number of motivated and trained student types, younger people, disillusioned, unemployed people who've gone through English language and media training programs and activism training programs run by NGOs and in the intelligence services, who will trigger the protests and provide the faces for the protest. You then need the muscle wing of that, which is the fascist types, terroristic types who will provide the violent element to that. And you need to combine all this together, of course, with the sort of domestic compradors, those who are already in power but think they can do better for themselves if they have, of course, the imperialists on their side. They might get a bigger slice of the cake than they've got already. So these are the elements that you need, I think, in place to carry out a successful color revolution. And if you look at Yugoslavia 2000, Georgia 2003, I believe, Ukraine 2004 was only a partial success for them. Then later on, you get similar thing happening in Armenia, which this is what brought Pashinyan to power. Ukraine itself, 2014. There are numerous other operations, such as there was similar things that happened in Kyrgyzstan, though not as successfully as it turned out. But those are the big ones. And the plan they have for Russia has gone wrong because the Putin group has proved too durable. The way in which they have handled the various sort of naked, open comprador elements has been quite deft. They rapidly imprisoned Khodorkovsky, and Putin was able to use the fact that Khodorkovsky and his ilk are despised by 80 to 90% of the Russian population as thieves and scumbags, which they are, and they got Khodorkovsky on a legitimate charge, which is that he was a tax evader. Of course he was. And so they eliminated the one by one. The Putin group got rid of the most naked compradors. So it started with Khodorkovsky. Ultimately, Putin's old friend, well, I don't know if they were ever friends, but a former ally of Putin, Boris Berezovsky, was driven into exile. Various others chose to jump out and spend more time with their money, or their stolen goods, I should say. And ultimately, the plans of MI6 and the CIA were uprooted bit by bit in Moscow and St. Petersburg, to the point where their big hope was Navalny, and that fucker proved to be very unreliable, and nobody was motivated to go out on the street for him when they finally brought the farce to a close and locked him up as the obvious agent of the US imperialist that he was. So it went wrong there. It's also not going to work in countries where there's a very strong link between the masses and the government. So in countries like Nicaragua or Venezuela, their coup attempts there in 2018, 2019 didn't work because of the fact that the masses are organized and have a direct role in the running of the state. And when that's the case, especially in Venezuela, where Chavez followed the advice of Castro and actually armed the masses, then you have a difficult situation for an attempted color revolution to overcome. Moving to Iran, any plan they have there, I think, stands absolutely no chance, even though, of course, that doesn't rule out them being able to commit an awful lot of violence inside the country, as they have done already. Because, even according to hostile estimates, around about between a fifth and a quarter of the population can be mobilized in support of the Islamic Republic at any given time. And many of those are, of course, organized in the various militia units known as, I think, the Besiege units. And these are armed units that are dedicated to the protection of the Khomeini's legacy, the Islamic Revolution. And, of course, you have the Revolutionary Guard Corps, which the US and the Israelis seem to be running some sort of assassination campaign against at the moment. Not that I don't think that will weaken it. It seems that they have a very deep bench of officers there who are, many of them, quite ideologically motivated. So this isn't going to work. The Islamic Republic whatever one may think of it, still has strong enough support within enough of the masses in Iran to withstand any destabilization operation. I think the Iranians are quite careful to eliminate or imprison the most open comprador elements or drive them into exile. And they've had many years to observe and have experienced themselves various US destabilization operations. So I think that the way in which the US thinks that, or the most aggressive elements in Washington and London think that this would go, isn't going to go their way. It's already not going their way. So I've talked for a while there, so I'm going to pause and take some more comments from the floor. Yes, Red Star Betty, I did have 3 bikes stolen. The best defense is to make it look like something that's not worth a penny. Trust me. Right, Oz, good evening to you. Yuan, hello to you out there in Phoenix, Arizona. Hello to HM down there in Brighton, who's walking home on the seafront. Brian Gillespie, good evening to you out there in Dublin. Neil Peckham says, evening from East Sussex, looking forward to another hour or so of sanity. Well, I hope I don't disappoint, for my own sake, if nothing else. Gonzalo Cabrera says hello from Spain, and good evening to you down there. James Graham says the liberation of Aleppo was a textbook example of how the Russians worked to minimize civilian casualties and other deaths. Yeah, and if you compare that to the way in which the US just essentially carpet bombed the shit out of Mosul, then you have a direct comparison to be made there. Hello to Isidore, and good evening to Jenny. Beju says, all strength to the Yemeni forces. What a fantastic example they are to all progressive forces fighting the imperialists. And Beju is exactly right. And Muzzle Paint, good evening, or I should say good afternoon. I think it still is to you down there in Maryland, USA. Rianne says, potentially dumb question. How does one differentiate between a colour revolution and genuine uprising against a regime? Are there specific things to watch out for? Yeah, I mean, this isn't a dumb question. I mean, it's a very legitimate question, and it can catch people out sometimes. So, for instance, first of all, we would be well advised to not respond in knee-jerk fashion when having to analyze something. And I'll give an example of this. Recently, I did an interview with the American communist Michael Christopher, the writer who lives out in Laos, and he and I were talking about the war that has gone on between the Myanmar military regime and the Burmese Communist Party and other forces who were aligned with Aung San Suu Kyi and wanted to return to civilian rule. Now, in my opinion, this is something that a lot of the multipolarists in particular got wrong, because they were assuming that because the Chinese government had relations with the Myanmar government, that the US imperialists and the British imperialists were behind somehow the uprising against the Myanmar government. Now, bear in mind that you need to assess each movement on its strengths. Now, according to all the information that I received about that, the movement there wasn't something that had been cooked up by the US imperialists. Now, I want to draw a distinction here. There's a difference between something which is a direct creation of US imperialism. Say, for instance, the Maidan was an obvious creation of US imperialism. It drew on things that were real. It drew on grievances that were legitimate with Yanukovych and everybody else who had ruled Ukraine. Ukraine was undoubtedly, under Yanukovych and before him Yushchenko and before him Leonid Kuchma, a state run by a group of grasping scumbag oligarchs where every election had been rigged, where the Communist Party should have won the parliamentary elections all the way through the 90s, and it was relentlessly rigged against them. And again, we've covered this before. The fact that they did nothing really to challenge that led to their own demise. And this was obviously a creation of US imperialism, but it was drawing on, it drew popular support that it did, partially through manipulations, but also it was a reflection of a completely failed state. Like Ukraine in 2014 was already a complete disaster that had been destroyed by a domestic oligarchy. So the thing, again, like to look at the Ukrainian example, the thing that you had to look at there was like, well, what is the dominant force? So if you look at the Myanmar example, the dominant force seems to be forces demanding a return to civilian rule and supported by, supplemented by a communist party that's been in existence in one form or another for a very long time, that isn't and doesn't have a record of being manipulated by the CIA as far as we know. So that, I think, is an organic creation of various struggles that are going on inside Myanmar itself. These aren't forces that have been created and trained and organized by imperialism. Does that mean that in the case of Myanmar, imperialism doesn't have an angle? Well, no, it doesn't. Imperialism always has an angle everywhere. You know, it's the nature of imperialism to look for an opening anywhere they can get. But there's a difference between the Ukraine situation, where they created the forces that were out in the street in 2014. They organized through long efforts the fascist groups in Ukraine, efforts that go back to pre-World War II. And of course, you can trace those efforts to the exiled fascist Ukrainian groups inside Canada particularly, and the USA. And you can therefore conclude, as people correctly did, and I was one who was wrong about the Maidan in 2014. I didn't support it, but I just said, well, it's a battle between two groups of oligarchs. Who cares? I got it wrong, and it took another few years for me to get it right, or more correct anyway. And again, like, you can then compare that to something which emerges organically, which the imperialists might try and exploit or find themselves an angle on, but that emerges from an organic process inside a country. The Ukraine situation, the problem there was that the whole thing had been created by outside forces. The same in Georgia. They exploited an existing situation in 2003 where Shevardnadze, the fucking scumbag ex-Soviet foreign minister who presided over the final capitulation and sellout in 1989 to 91, he'd ruled Georgia since just after independence, taking over from another bunch of scumbags, and he'd run a corrupt, useless regime that had essentially betrayed all of the promises that it had made upon independence from the Soviet Union, unsurprisingly, and the economy hadn't really gone forward, and there was a lot of frustration. But as soon as it started, looking back now, I mean, at the time I didn't even notice it because I was too busy drinking my way through university. Again, like, you notice the things that the activists in the streets are demanding, the flags that they are waving, the way in which they're constantly making an appeal to the West to intervene on their behalf, the fact that the leadership of it is pretty easily identifiable as a CIA plant. It's like you can start to judge these things according to, well, what are the leading forces? Research into, well, what is the balance of class forces in this movement? Now, the last time I spoke to Comrade Don Corter from the Revolution Report, who's also a reporter for RT. When I first interviewed him, he was in Tbilisi covering the last round of attempted colour revolutions. If you look back on my conversation with him, you can see that one of the things that is noticeable is that in these colour revolutions, it's very, very rare that there is any organised working class presence. In the case of Ukraine, what happened was people like Poroshenko and other oligarchs who ran factories tried to essentially do a lockout and force their workers to attend. And when that didn't work, and attend the rallies. When that didn't work, they created fake worker organizations and declared that they were supported by the workers. So this is part of what goes on here. And by analyzing the balance of forces as far as we can, and we've got a better idea now of the way that the US plays its games. I'll give another example here. You can analyze the way the US plays its games, and you can analyze what's organic and what isn't. So, for instance, the workers' struggles in Kazakhstan that began the revolt that was ultimately exploited by somebody. It's still unclear exactly who. In the very beginning of 2022, just before the Russian special military operation started, they ran that CSTO operation to stabilize the Tokayev government in Kazakhstan. Tokayev, of course, is carrying on the traditions of Nursultan Nazarbayev by tap dancing along the fine line between the US bloc and their alliance with Russia, but they're never going to give up the alliance with Russia. Now, Putin himself said something interesting about this. He said that the protest was started by a legitimate grievance, and it was there were worker protests against a hike in gas prices, if I recall correctly. And so this is the process you have to go through in analyzing this. Yes, in Kazakhstan's case, it was a bit more dodgy because the whole thing turned out to be a power move by Tokayev's group to essentially take out the remnants of the Nazarbayev group. And it was said at the time, oh my God, it's a color revolution. Well, no, it turned out it was an operation that the Russians and Tokayev had planned to eliminate the remnants of Nazarbayev's influence. Because Nazarbayev was a lot closer to British imperialism in particular. So were color revolutions going on there? No, the opposite was going on there. And of course, there will be, anytime there is worker disturbances in Kazakhstan, and there's a lot of them because the situation there for the working class is abysmal, what we should bear in mind is that there's a strong history of working class action against Nazarbayev's regime and now against Tokayev's regime. And by the way, both are dirty as fuck and have all made deals with imperialism. But again, we should analyze and look at and know, and informed by our experience of Ukraine and other color revolutions, how to respond to something when it comes up. I see there are more questions. Maybe to follow up on Rianne's question, to what extent was the Libyan civil war a genuine uprising? It wasn't. I mean, you also say on the Arab Spring overall. The Arab Spring, I mean, I don't even like the term, to be honest. I mean, it reminds me of working in the civil service where everything suddenly had the subtitle with reference to the Arab Spring. In Tunisia, that started with a real problem, with a real class battle against Zine Abidine Ben Ali, the longtime French allied and US allied dictator there. And it was led by the UGTT, Tunisian Trade Union Federation. And the French and the US would not have wanted to get rid of Ben Ali. He was a very useful asset for them, just as they didn't want to get rid of Mubarak. Like, if you remember Obama's response to the protests in Egypt, it was very hesitant. It was like he didn't quite know what to do. And then they certainly didn't want the Muslim Brotherhood getting into power because, of course, for all that they're a dubious organization at best, they were committing to opening the border crossing with Gaza. That was one thing that Mohamed Morsi was committed to. And that's why, was one of the reasons why he was deposed. And so the uprisings in Tunisia and Egypt were coming from a real place of anger and frustration at these puppet regimes that were being run there, that were both allies of imperialism. Now, I've spoken to, and I will be revisiting this subject, I've spoken about the Libyan civil war on numerous occasions. Now, the question over how genuine this was is quite a difficult one to address. And it's here that I'll turn to some conversations I had with Matteo Capasso, the author of Everyday Politics in the Libyan Arab Jamahiriya, and the way in which he describes it in his book, and it's a very interesting book that I would recommend you all read, is that there were problems in Libya, and that these problems had gone back probably around about 25 years, partly connected with the decline and fall of the socialist bloc and the loss of the trading opportunities that provided, and there was also a lot of nepotism and corruption in the Gaddafi government. All of that is true. Now, what happened, of course, in the east of the country around Benghazi, there were riots, and there was, of course, discontent in the country. All of that is true. What happened then was, of course, that the US imperialists then had got their game face on and had decided that this was now the moment that they were going to lean into this. Because what had become clear was that in both Tunisia and Egypt, that the movements against the dictatorships had both been largely, if not leaderless, then under the influence of people who had no real positive agenda, or certainly no agenda that could hope to challenge this subordinate position that both these nations are in vis-a-vis imperialism. The way in which this manifested itself in terms of US action was that they moved quickly on Libya to essentially get themselves back on track, because George W. Bush in 2006 had been obliged, due to political desperation and failure in Iraq, to look as if he'd delivered something by cutting a deal with Gaddafi. So this was then a game. They then returned to the original plan, I mean to say, in 2011, and when the riots started in Benghazi, and it looked like Gaddafi was going to be able to wrap these up and repress them. What they then did, though, was they looked for a justification to start a bombing campaign, which is why they came up with that elaborate, well, not very elaborate, but over-the-top lie about Gaddafi getting a rape squad ready to go into Benghazi, and he was going to go in there with tanks and machine gun everybody. You know, the usual vivid stories that you get about potential massacres, when, of course, we all know who the biggest purveyors of massacres really are. So they moved like they did in Libya because it gave them an opportunity to carry out a regime change operation that they'd wanted to do 10 years earlier in 2001. And speaking to and reading Matteo Capasso's book, it's clear that they imported a lot of people, Libyan exiles. We know, for instance, that they took a lot of Libyan exiles who had been living in Britain and took them back there. They essentially built a jihadist army that was essentially used as a ground force for imperialism, whilst the British and French and the US provided the air support. And so Libya especially gave them an opportunity to continue the regime change operation that had, of course, started in 2001. The opportunity to do it had emerged in 2001. So this is, of course, a very sort of brief reading of the situation. But what I would say is this: that the economic crisis that caused the uprisings in Tunisia and Egypt was a real thing. That the problem was, of course, that there was no communist presence that was strong enough in either country to push it in the direction of a positive outcome, or there was no even sort of strong nationalist force at the time in Tunisia or Egypt that could push it in the right direction. And once this happens in these cases, then again, to draw from something Lenin said, when power falls in the street, it all depends upon who picks it up. And there was only two organized forces in Egypt, one of which was the Muslim Brotherhood, who came to power via the presidency of Morsi, and the other one was the army commanders, who were, of course, complete stooges of US imperialism. And so you end up with a situation where you have the Muslim Brotherhood, who have all kinds of dubious connections to both Saudi Arabia and Erdogan in Turkey, and you have the army commanders who are direct stooges of the US. And ultimately it was the army commanders who stepped in, following a protest movement that was largely kicked off by the Egyptian middle class, who feared that the Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood were going to impose some sort of Sharia law type Saudi rule, which would be very ill-suited for the kind of society that Egypt actually is. So, moving back to the questions and comments, Rianne says, would you consider the protest in Iran against the mandatory hijab as a colour revolution, or imperialists taking advantage of the women's grievances? That's a long response. There are real antagonisms inside Iran. Let's be clear about that. There are real contradictions there that the imperialists are constantly looking to get an angle on. Now, I would also say that, look, the protests came from a real place, but at the same time, the imperialists were working very hard to turn it into a crisis for the Islamic Republic. I would say, though, that there is a strong point of view, even amongst Iranians inside Iran, who aren't particularly fond of this system that the Islamic Republic has in place there, whereby they are not prepared to see the country reduced back to the status that it had under the Shah. So this is why I think US imperialism is barking at the wrong tree. They tried with the so-called Green Revolution against Ahmadinejad in 2009, I think it was. They tried again with the hijab protests, and both times it ends in failure. I think again, it comes back to the question of the Iranian system having enough popular support and roots in the Iranian masses, and a wider, more nationalist point of view within Iran that is not prepared to see sort of movements organized by rather open stooges of the US come to power. Now, this doesn't mean that there aren't contradictions in Iran that will one day return with a vengeance, such as class contradictions in Iran. There's a lot of class battles in Iran that kind of happen under the surface because they're not really reported on or talked about. And those, of course, at the moment, due to the fact that the country is still on the front line of a battle against imperialism, take a kind of secondary role. Because if you don't have independence and you're dominated by imperialism, then you've got even more of a problem. So that's where I would say it is. Like a lot of these things, a lot of these issues, they are real, but as long as the country remains on the front line against US imperialism, and US imperialism is constantly trying to destroy the independence of the country, even people who don't like the current regime will put things a little bit on the back burner and not be prepared to go along with something that could end with a US puppet regime sitting in Tehran. Not that I think that that's got much of a chance of succeeding. If you want more on that, I can talk more about it tomorrow. President Jesus says, UAW President Sean Fain has endorsed Joe Biden. His celebrated call to cease the mass slaughter in Gaza lasted about 2 weeks. Well, what can I say? I'm sure American comrades are familiar with the union bureaucrat who talks a good game one day, then endorses some scumbag the next. I mean, even if, let's just assume for a moment that we leave aside Biden's open endorsement of Netanyahu's murderous rampage in Gaza and elsewhere. let's leave that aside. What's Biden actually done to advance the cause of the American worker over the last 4 years to justify an endorsement by one of the biggest unions in the country? Now, I don't know whether anybody can answer the question of does the UAW go through a democratic process to decide who it endorses? Has Fain endorsed Biden personally, or is he speaking just for himself, or is he doing it on behalf of the entire UAW? But I'm not surprised, to be honest. I mean, any progress the UAW has made is going to be thanks to their strong level of workplace organization. Fain might talk a good game, but if he's prepared to endorse Biden, then essentially it renders anything else that he said completely irrelevant, because you've decided that you just prefer your flavor of anti-worker rule with a veneer of fake promises, which is all Biden's really delivered, and a veneer of so-called civility, rather than Trump's way, which is no promises and open celebration of whatever the fuck it is that Netanyahu wants to do. So, yeah, not surprised. I've seen this happen. We will have all seen it happen, but I've seen this happen many times in Britain. The left union bureaucrats go in a circle. They go from election time, declaring that we have to insert your right-wing party here, Tories, Republicans, Partido Popolare out because fascism is on the horizon, to then 2 years, let's say a year to 2 years away from an election, halfway between, you then get the union leaders striking a more militant line and saying, we're not going to accept two flavors of Tory or Republican or PP or Macron or whatever. Then we get to close to the election again, and the traditional connection kicks in, and it's vote Labour or against Tory fascism. Vote Biden to keep out orange Mussolini, Vote, PSOE in Spain to keep out, the rebirth of Franco or something like that. It's the same bullshit from the same compromised bureaucrats every single time. And quite frankly, I hope that no UAW member listens to him, because Biden deserves to lose. The only problem you've got is, of course, Trump doesn't deserve to win, but Trump winning will, of course, cause a lot of chaos, which is the only thing you can say that is positive about him. But yeah, Sean Fain, the left's darling, of course, endorses Genocide Joe. I hope that somebody confronts these people. I know there's been a lot of confrontation done to Biden, but somebody should go after and just stage a confrontation with some of these union leaders, especially somebody like Fain, who's decided to endorse Genocide Joe. He should be confronted, ideally by his own members at his own meetings. UAW members should question him on it. About colour revolutions, what do you think about the recent protests in Serbia? Was it the start of a coup project by the imperialists? Well, yes, it was. They were quite open about it, to be honest. Again, there's a very strong anti-US, anti-EU, anti-NATO sentiment inside Serbia, which I think would have seen off any attempted colour revolution. That doesn't mean for an instant that I think Vucic is any good. I think he's a fucking wretched scumbag. But again, he is preserved where he is because of the fact that the Serbian worker organization is nowhere near strong enough, and the Serbian left is a mess, as far as I can tell. There are some very small Marxist-Leninist groups out there that I need to do more research on, but essentially I don't think that the imperialists were going to be able to succeed there because they're so despised by a gigantic majority of the Serbian population. Doesn't mean they won't keep trying, though, and it doesn't mean they don't have compradors and collaborators in the Serbian ruling class. They almost certainly do. Could I do an episode on Myanmar? Well, if you haven't listened to it already, go back and listen to the interview on the anti-junta movement I did. It's back in the audio archive. Listen to that first, then let me know if you want to revisit it. In the case of Tunisia, I know for certain, this is from Luca, that there was a lot of movement around the US embassy before the uprising. That may well be the case. I don't know enough to say whether how significant it was, but certainly it's the case that in a lot of these countries, the living situation got pretty fucking dire after the 2008 economic collapse, to the point where like the life for the working class population in Tunisia and Egypt and other places got very difficult, and there was a lot of class struggle that emerged. There was a lot of class struggle against Mubarak, dating back to his decision to try and withdraw or cut, I think it was, subsidies on bread. It's because the population was unable to afford the essentials of life. So these all come from, a lot of this came from places of real class conflict. Let's not make mistakes here. Ben Ali and Mubarak were both stooges of imperialism. Now, whether the US decided that it could find a better stooge by mobilizing its networks in Tunisia, I don't know, but certainly this started from a real position where the Tunisian working class had faced greater and greater immiseration. They still do, by the way, because they were completely unable to overcome the contradictions there imposed by the fact that imperialism still dominates Tunisia to this day. Right. Okay, you want more on the Rian? Can you confirm you want more specifically on the Iran question or something broader? Right. Lucas says, may I ask for a future episode on power? Is it power that you're saying there? I can't see it because the emoji symbol is in the way of your question. You're going to have to elaborate when you say, if you're saying power there, what variation of it do you mean? Do you mean state power? Do you mean taking power? If you can clarify your comment, I can make a note of it. Right. Right, okay, it is just past midnight here in the land of perfidious Albion, so I am going to bring it to a close there. So thank you to everybody who's contributed to what's turned out to be a very lively discussion this evening. Okay, Lucas clarified state power very well. I will be back again. Tomorrow is going to be a bit different because I'm doing a live stream with Don Corter of the Revolution Report on population decline and birth rate decline. So tune into that on the Revolution Report's YouTube channel if you can, tomorrow from 7:30 British time. And I'll be back with the regular stream on Friday of this week. So until then, I will say thank you to everybody who has tuned in and raised a question. If I didn't get to your question, make a note of it and put it in the Telegram group. Or email it to me at the following email address, which I'm going to put into the chat right now. It's Marx Engels Institute. Sorry, I've got this thing wrong. Editor at Marx Engels Institute.org. Okay, got a question for me? Email it to me there. I will be back again with this program on Friday. Until then, thank you for tuning in, and I'll be back with you again tomorrow in a slightly different format. Please tune in for that as well.
Oh, Stalin was a mighty man, and a mighty man was he. He led the Soviet people on the road to victory. All through the revolution, he fought at Lenin's side, and they made